In the heart of 1960s Harlem, there existed a man whose name alone could stop violence before it started. A figure so commanding that a simple nod of his head determined whether blood would spill or peace would reign on the streets. And yet the question that haunts historians and residents alike is whether Elliott "Bumpy" Johnson was truly the guardian angel who kept Harlem safe from the ravages of organized crime, or whether he was simply the most powerful crime boss who managed to control his criminal empire so effectively that it appeared to the outside world, and perhaps even to the residents who lived under his rule, that he was actually preventing crime rather than orchestrating it from the shadows. The story of Bumpy Johnson is not a simple tale of a hero standing against corruption, nor is it merely the biography of a ruthless gangster. It is instead a complex and deeply human narrative that sits in the murky spaces between myth and reality, between folk legend and historical fact, between the streets of Harlem as people remember them and the Harlem that actually existed during one of the most transformative and turbulent periods in American urban history. To understand Bumpy Johnson, we must first understand the Harlem that created him, the world that he emerged from, and the desperate circumstances that made someone like him not just possible but almost inevitable. And we must ask ourselves whether the world that Bumpy built was actually better than the alternatives that surrounded it, or whether it was simply a different kind of cage with a more sympathetic keeper. The 1920s and 1930s saw Harlem transform from a predominantly white upper-class neighborhood into the cultural, artistic, and social heartland of Black America, a place where the Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans fleeing the crushing oppression of the Jim Crow South, seeking opportunity and dignity in the northern cities where, they had been told, a Black person could build a life and perhaps even prosper. Harlem became the site of the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of Black artistic and intellectual achievement that would reshape American culture forever, producing legends like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and countless others who found in Harlem a community that celebrated their gifts and gave them space to create. Yet this same Harlem, for all its cultural glory, was also a place of grinding poverty, overcrowding, police brutality, and systematic exclusion from legitimate economic opportunities, a place where jobs were scarce, where housing was deliberately denied to Black families through practices like redlining, where schools were underfunded and crumbling, and where the police treated the Black residents as an occupying force might treat a conquered people. It was into this world of contradictions, where art and culture flourished alongside desperate poverty, where ambition and despair coexisted on the same streets, that Elliott Johnson was born in 1905, coming into the world during the first great wave of the Great Migration, when Harlem was still being transformed from what it had been into what it would become. Young Elliott grew up in the rougher parts of Harlem, in a neighborhood where legitimate paths to success were systematically blocked for people of his race, where schools provided minimal education, where employers refused to hire Black workers for anything more than the most menial and degrading jobs, and where the police represented not protection but threat. His early life was marked by the kind of petty poverty that characterized much of the Black urban experience of his era, and from his youth, he displayed the kind of intelligence, charisma, and ruthlessness that would eventually elevate him above his circumstances, though it would be through criminal channels rather than legitimate ones. By the 1920s, Harlem was becoming a hub of illicit activity, particularly the bootlegging trade that flourished during Prohibition, and the vast criminal enterprises that supplied alcohol to speakeasies, gin joints, and private drinking clubs had become a major economic engine in the neighborhood, one that provided income and opportunity to thousands of people who were locked out of legitimate employment. The white crime syndicates that ran the major bootlegging operations saw Harlem as a territory to be exploited, and they controlled the major trafficking routes and wholesale suppliers, but they needed local operators who understood the community, who could move through Harlem without attracting attention, and who could manage the street-level logistics of the illegal drug and alcohol trade. Young Elliott Johnson proved to be exceptionally good at this work, and he built a reputation as someone who could be trusted, who paid his debts, who dealt fairly with people in his orbit, and who was willing to use violence when necessary to maintain order and protect his interests. Over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, he rose through the ranks of Harlem's criminal underworld, building a network of relationships, establishing himself as a power broker, and earning the nickname Bumpy because of a noticeable bump on his head, reportedly from a childhood accident. And by the 1930s, he had become one of the most significant figures in Harlem's shadow economy. The police knew who he was, the other criminals knew who he was, and increasingly the residents of Harlem knew who he was, and they began to develop a complicated relationship with this man who was undeniably a criminal, who was undeniably engaged in activities that caused harm, but who also seemed to operate according to a certain code of ethics that was increasingly absent from mainstream American society. What made Bumpy Johnson different from other organized crime figures was not that he didn't engage in criminal activity. He absolutely did, and the scope of his criminal enterprises was vast and destructive, but rather that he maintained a presence in the community in a way that other crime bosses did not, that he reinvested some of his ill-gotten gains back into Harlem in ways that were visible and appreciated by residents, and that he established a reputation as someone who would intervene on behalf of community members when they were being abused by other criminals or by the police. There are countless stories, many of which have become legendary in the folklore of Harlem, about times when Bumpy would step in to protect someone from violence, when he would ensure that a widow could keep her apartment or feed her children, when he would use his power and influence to prevent a tragedy or to help someone in need. And whether all of these stories are literally true is perhaps less important than the fact that enough of them were true, or true enough. That Bumpy developed a reputation as a protector and a guardian, someone who, for all his criminal activity, seemed to understand himself as having some responsibility to the community that had nurtured him and given him the foundation for his power. This is the central tension in the Bumpy Johnson story, and it is the question that we must grapple with throughout this documentary. Is it possible for a man engaged in serious criminal activity to also be a genuine protector of his community? Or does the very nature of crime make such a thing impossible, a mere illusion that obscures the fundamental harm that organized crime necessarily inflicts? The answer, it seems, is that the Bumpy Johnson who lived was simultaneously both a criminal exploiter of his own community and a figure who genuinely intervened to protect people, a person whose actions cannot be neatly categorized as either heroic or villainous, but rather must be understood in their full and messy complexity. During the 1940s and 1950s, Bumpy Johnson's criminal empire expanded significantly, and he became increasingly involved in the heroin trade, which was becoming the dominant economic force in organized crime in Harlem and across America's cities. And it is here that we begin to see more clearly the contradictions and complications in the Bumpy Johnson narrative. Heroin was devastatingly addictive, and its introduction into Harlem in large quantities during the post-World War II period created a generation of drug addicts, many of them young black men who had fought in World War II or the Korean War and come home to find that society had no place for them, that legitimate opportunities remained closed, and that heroin offered at least a temporary escape from the despair of their circumstances. Bumpy Johnson and the other heroin dealers in Harlem made enormous profits from this trade, profits that were built literally on the bodies and souls of addicts who were destroying their families, their lives, and their futures with every injection. And there is no way to square this reality with any narrative of Bumpy Johnson as a community protector. The heroin trade was not a victimless crime. It was not a business that existed in some moral gray area, and it was not something that could be justified by appeals to limited opportunities or systemic racism, though those factors certainly provided the context in which such a trade could flourish. Yet at the same time, we must acknowledge that Bumpy Johnson did not create the circumstances that made Harlem fertile ground for heroin trafficking. Those circumstances were created by centuries of racism, by the systematic exclusion of Black Americans from legitimate economic participation, by the poverty and desperation that characterized Black urban communities in the post-World War II period, and by the fact that the legitimate economy had nothing to offer to millions of young Black people who had no other way to escape the trap of poverty and marginalization. The question of whether Bumpy Johnson kept crime out of Harlem becomes more complicated when we examine what actually happened during his era of dominance, because it becomes clear that what Bumpy was doing was not preventing crime, but rather monopolizing it, not eliminating the drug trade, but rather controlling it, creating a system in which some people engaged in criminal activity under his aegis, while others were protected from criminal victimization, at least in theory. This is a distinction that matters tremendously, because it suggests that the alternatives to Bumpy Johnson's rule were not necessarily a Harlem free from crime. Such a thing was probably impossible given the economic and social circumstances of the period, but rather a Harlem in which crime was more chaotic, more violent, more unpredictable, in which multiple competing criminal organizations were fighting for territory and dominance, leaving bodies in the streets and terrorizing the civilian population. By the 1950s, when Bumpy Johnson had reached the height of his power in Harlem, he had also become increasingly well known to law enforcement, and he was arrested multiple times on various charges, including the major 1952 narcotics bust that resulted in a significant prison sentence, an arrest that demonstrated both the reach of his criminal enterprise and the growing attention that law enforcement was paying to his activities. The 1950s were a period when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, then under the leadership of Harry Anslinger, was intensifying its focus on the heroin trade, and Bumpy Johnson found himself increasingly targeted by federal law enforcement agencies that viewed him as one of the major traffickers operating in New York City. His conviction and imprisonment was a significant moment in his career, and it temporarily disrupted the criminal operations that he had built, but it also served to enhance his legend, because he served his time with dignity and emerged from prison, still commanding respect and loyalty from those who worked for him, suggesting a kind of code of honor that contrasted sharply with the betrayals and violence that characterized much of the organized crime world. When Bumpy Johnson emerged from prison in the late 1950s, he returned to a Harlem that had changed significantly during his absence, a neighborhood that was still struggling with many of the same problems it had always faced, but also a community that had developed new forms of organization and resistance, new voices calling for change and justice, and a growing civil rights movement that would soon explode across the nation. It was during this period, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, that Bumpy Johnson would achieve his greatest cultural prominence and would become the figure most associated in the public imagination with crime and power in Harlem. And it was during this period that his relationship with another powerful figure, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, would become one of the most significant and transformative partnerships in his life. The Nation of Islam, under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, had been growing in influence and numbers throughout the 1950s, and by the late 1950s, it had become a major force in Harlem and in Black communities across the nation, offering an alternative vision of Black identity, Black dignity, and Black power that resonated deeply with people who had been marginalized and humiliated by American racism. Malcolm X, who would emerge as the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam and one of the most powerful and influential voices in the Black freedom struggle, had grown up in Harlem and understood the neighborhood intimately, understood the dynamics of power and control that characterized the streets, and understood the appeal that an organization like the Nation of Islam had for people seeking meaning, structure, and dignity in their lives. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X is one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of the Bumpy Johnson story, and it reveals something profound about the complexity of power, morality, and community in the context of Black struggle in America. Some accounts suggest that Bumpy and Malcolm developed a relationship of mutual respect, that Bumpy actually provided protection for Malcolm X and for the Nation of Islam when they faced threats from rivals and enemies, and that there was a kind of understanding between these two powerful men that they served different functions in the community, but that they shared a fundamental commitment to Black power and Black dignity. Other accounts suggest that Malcolm X was deliberately distancing himself from criminal elements like Bumpy Johnson, that he viewed the Nation of Islam as fundamentally incompatible with organized crime, and that any appearance of collaboration or cooperation was overstated or misremembered. The truth, as is often the case, seems to lie somewhere between these two poles, and it seems likely that Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X had some level of contact, and perhaps even cooperation during the period when Malcolm was ascending to prominence in Harlem, but that this relationship was complicated by fundamental differences in their vision for Black progress and Black freedom. What is clear is that during the late 1950s and early 1960s, Harlem was becoming a crucible of different visions of Black power and Black liberation, with the Nation of Islam, civil rights organizations, emerging activist groups, and the existing power structures all competing for influence and adherence. And in this context, Bumpy Johnson represented an older vision of power, power based on criminal enterprise and personal dominance, while Malcolm X represented a newer vision of power, power based on ideological commitment and mass organization. The question of what Bumpy Johnson was actually accomplishing during this period requires us to examine the actual conditions in Harlem and to distinguish between mythology and reality. Because while there is no question that Bumpy was deeply involved in the criminal enterprises that plagued the community, the extent to which he was actually reducing crime or merely controlling it has been the subject of considerable historical dispute. Some historians and longtime Harlem residents argue that during Bumpy Johnson's era of dominance, the neighborhood experienced less random violence and more stable conditions than it had during periods when his power was contested or absent, and they point to the fact that Bumpy reportedly had rules that his subordinates had to follow, rules about not dealing in certain areas, about not harming civilians unnecessarily, about maintaining order and predictability in the streets. Other historians argue that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what was actually happening, that Bumpy's control of the criminal enterprises meant that more drugs were flowing into the neighborhood under his direction, that more addiction was being created and sustained through his business operations, and that the relative lack of open warfare between criminal factions during his dominance was not actually a good thing, but rather a sign that one criminal power had successfully monopolized an evil trade at the expense of the broader community. The truth seems to be that both of these perspectives contain elements of reality, and that what Bumpy Johnson actually did was create a system of organized crime that was simultaneously more stable and more destructive than the alternatives, that he reduced certain kinds of violence while enabling and profiting from other kinds of violence, and that the experience of living in Harlem during his era of dominance would have been very different depending on whether you were inside his organization, protected by his rules and his power, or outside it, exposed to the various dangers and depredations that characterized Black urban life in America. The heroin epidemic that Bumpy Johnson profited from and helped to enable was one of the most significant public health crises of the second half of the 20th century, and its impact on Harlem and on Black communities across America cannot be overstated or minimized by appeals to Bumpy's other activities or his protection of community members in certain circumstances. Thousands of people, primarily young black men and women, became addicted to heroin during the years when Bumpy Johnson was one of the primary distributors of the drug in Harlem, and many of them died. Many others destroyed their families and their potential, and entire communities were destabilized by the epidemic that Bumpy helped to create and perpetuate. The young people who became addicted to heroin during this period were not abstract economic statistics. They were the sons and daughters of Harlem. They were potential leaders and artists and workers who might have contributed to their communities and their society. But instead, they were destroyed by an addiction that was deliberately marketed and distributed by people like Bumpy Johnson in the pursuit of profit. This is not to say that Bumpy Johnson single-handedly created the heroin epidemic, because clearly the crisis had much deeper roots in American society, in the racism and poverty and marginalization that characterized the black urban experience. But it is to say that Bumpy Johnson made a conscious choice to participate in and profit from this epidemic, and that this choice had devastating consequences for the community that he claimed to be protecting. Yet even as we acknowledge this reality, we must also acknowledge that the world that surrounded Bumpy Johnson and Harlem during this period was itself shaped by forces far larger than any individual criminal, that the heroin epidemic was not simply the product of Bumpy Johnson's ambitions, but rather was part of a much larger pattern of what some historians have called a kind of genocide against black communities. A pattern of policies and practices that deliberately introduced drugs and criminality into black neighborhoods as a way of controlling and exploiting black populations. By the 1960s, Bumpy Johnson had reached the height of his power and influence in Harlem, and he was widely recognized by residents as the dominant figure in the neighborhood's shadow economy, the man who controlled what happened on the streets and who had the power to determine whether disputes would be settled peacefully or violently. During this period, Harlem was undergoing significant social and political transformations, with the rise of the civil rights movement, the growth of black consciousness and black nationalism, the emergence of figures like Malcolm X who were advocating for a different vision of black power, and the beginning of what would eventually become the Black Power movement. It was in this context that Bumpy Johnson's legacy and his reputation were being constructed and refined, and it was during this period that the mythology of Bumpy Johnson began to crystallize into the form that it would take in the historical record and in the cultural memory of Harlem. The Civil Rights era and the broader movement for black liberation created a context in which figures like Bumpy Johnson could be reinterpreted and revalued, in which his criminal activities could be downplayed or reframed as responses to systemic injustice, and in which his protection of the community could be emphasized and celebrated, while his participation in the heroin trade was minimized or excused. This process of myth-making is understandable, because during this period there was genuine and desperate need for figures who embodied power and resistance to white supremacy, and because legitimate channels for such power were effectively closed to black people in America, and because Bumpy Johnson was undeniably powerful, undeniably fearless in the face of white authority, and undeniably willing to use his power for some purposes that benefited his community. But it is important that we recognize this process of myth-making for what it is, and that we maintain a clear-eyed understanding of what Bumpy Johnson actually was and actually did, even as we appreciate the historical and social context that made him possible, and that made his rise to power a kind of inevitable response to systematic injustice and exclusion. One of the most important moments in Bumpy Johnson's later life came when he began to work with, or perhaps more accurately, when he was forced to cooperate with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, providing information about other drug dealers and traffickers in exchange for certain concessions or protections. And this aspect of his story reveals something significant about the nature of organized crime and the relationships between criminals and law enforcement. The partnership between Bumpy Johnson and law enforcement is one of the most contested and least understood aspects of his biography, with some sources suggesting that he actively cooperated with federal agents, providing them with information about competitors and rivals, while other sources suggest that any cooperation was minimal or incidental to his primary activities. What seems to be clear is that by the 1960s, Bumpy Johnson had developed relationships with federal law enforcement that were more complicated than simple opposition, that he understood that his power depended on maintaining certain forms of legitimacy and acceptance among the authorities who could otherwise destroy him, and that he was willing to use his relationships with law enforcement to eliminate competitors and to consolidate his power. This aspect of the Bumpy Johnson story is particularly important because it demonstrates that the line between criminality and law enforcement in the context of organized crime in Harlem was not as clear and sharp as it might have appeared, that there were connections and relationships and mutual understandings between criminals and law enforcement agents, and that the criminal enterprises that flourished in Harlem were not simply tolerated or ignored by the police and federal authorities, but rather were managed and controlled by those authorities in ways that reflected their own priorities and interests. The police and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were not interested in eliminating the drug trade in Harlem. To do so would have been impossible and would have required resources and commitment that they were not willing to provide, but rather they were interested in controlling it, managing it, and ensuring that it did not get so violent or so visible that it created a public relations crisis. Bumpy Johnson understood this reality, and he cultivated relationships with law enforcement that allowed him to operate with a certain degree of protection and impunity, as long as he maintained certain rules and agreements about how his criminal operations would be conducted. This created a situation in which the government was essentially licensing certain forms of criminal activity in Harlem, ensuring that the drug trade would continue under controlled conditions, and benefiting from the stability that came from having one dominant crime figure in charge rather than multiple competing factions. The implications of this realization are quite profound, because it suggests that the Harlem that Bumpy Johnson controlled was not simply a place where he was preventing crime, or even where he was controlling crime in some simple sense, but rather a place where crime was being deliberately managed by multiple actors: the criminals themselves, the police, federal law enforcement, all of whom had their own interests in maintaining certain conditions and preventing others. In this light, the question of whether Bumpy Johnson kept crime out of Harlem, or just controlled, it becomes less a question about Bumpy's personal morality or his intentions, and more a question about the structure of organized crime and law enforcement in American cities during this period, about the systems that allowed such arrangements to exist, and about the complicity of government authorities in the continuation of the drug trade and other criminal enterprises that devastated black communities. The later years of Bumpy Johnson's life, from the mid-1960s onward, saw his power and influence gradually diminish, as new forms of organized crime emerged, as the community he had dominated changed and evolved, and as he himself aged out of the period of his greatest prominence. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, new criminal figures were rising in Harlem, young men who had learned their trade in the streets, and who were not bound by the same kinds of codes or understandings that had characterized Bumpy's era, and the relative stability that had characterized the neighborhood during Bumpy's dominance began to break down. The introduction of crack cocaine in the 1980s would transform the drug trade entirely, and would make the relatively controlled situation that had existed during Bumpy's time seem almost nostalgic by comparison. And by this time, Bumpy Johnson was already deceased, having died in 1968 at the age of 62. The exact circumstances of Bumpy's death have been the subject of some speculation and myth-making, with some sources suggesting that he died in the company of Malcolm X, who was himself assassinated in 1965, while other sources indicate that Bumpy was simply dying of natural causes related to his age and his lifestyle. What is clear is that Bumpy Johnson's death marked the end of an era in Harlem, the end of the period when one man could claim dominance over the criminal enterprises that operated in the neighborhood, and the beginning of a period of greater fragmentation and chaos. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson is therefore a complicated one, and it cannot be summed up in simple terms of hero or villain, protector or exploiter, because he was simultaneously all of these things, and because his life and his actions can only be properly understood within the context of the system of racism, poverty, and marginalization that produced him, and that made his rise to power possible. The mythology of Bumpy Johnson that has developed in the decades since his death has tended to emphasize his protective and guardianship functions, while minimizing or downplaying his role in the heroin trade and the devastating consequences of that trade for his community. And while it is understandable that people who lived through his era and who experienced his protection would want to remember him in a particular way, it is important that we as historians, and as people interested in truth, maintain a more complete and complex understanding of who he was and what he did. The actual historical record suggests that Bumpy Johnson was a man who operated within a criminal system, who profited from that system, and who used some of his profits and his power to intervene in community matters in ways that were sometimes protective and sometimes self-serving, and who created a situation in which the neighborhood under his control was more stable and less violently chaotic than it might have been, but also in which the drug trade that destroyed countless lives was flourishing under his direct management and profit. To answer the question posed at the beginning of this documentary, did Bumpy Johnson actually keep crime out of Harlem or just control it? We must recognize that these are not mutually exclusive options, that he both controlled crime, and that this control had the effect of reducing certain visible forms of violence, but that this control was exercised through his dominance of the criminal enterprises themselves, and that his power and protection were built on the foundation of profits extracted from the bodies and souls of drug addicts. The Harlem of Bumpy Johnson's time was not free from crime. It was rather a place where crime was effectively monopolized, where the rules were set by one powerful man and his organization, and where those within the system received certain protections while those outside it remained vulnerable. Whether this situation was actually better than the alternatives that surrounded it, whether a Harlem with less organized control would have been safer, whether a Harlem without the heroin trade would have been healthier, are questions that can never be definitively answered, because those alternative scenarios never actually existed in pure form. What we can say is that Bumpy Johnson's Harlem was a place of real contradictions, where extraordinary acts of community protection coexisted with systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable people in the community, where personal loyalty and honor existed alongside betrayal and violence, and where one man's power to keep some people safe depended fundamentally on his power to keep other people enslaved to drugs that he was providing and profiting from. The larger story of Bumpy Johnson is also the story of Harlem during a critical period in American history, a period when black communities were fighting for dignity and freedom through the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, when the Great Society was promising to eliminate poverty and inequality, and when the foundation was being laid for the policies and practices that would eventually lead to mass incarceration, and the war on drugs that would devastate black communities far more thoroughly than any individual crime boss ever could. It is worth noting that the systems of control that eventually replaced Bumpy Johnson's informal rule, the criminal justice system, the police apparatus, the prison industrial complex, have proven to be even more destructive to black communities than organized crime ever was, and that millions of black people have been incarcerated, destroyed, and killed by these systems in ways that far exceed the damage caused by the heroin trade or any other form of organized crime. In this light, the mythology of Bumpy Johnson as a protector of his community, while exaggerated and incomplete, reflects something real about the difference between systems of control that maintain some level of accountability to the community and systems of control that are imposed from outside and that serve interests opposed to the community's well-being. This does not justify Bumpy Johnson's criminal enterprises or his participation in the heroin trade, but it does provide some context for understanding why people who lived through his era and who experienced his protection might view him with gratitude and appreciation despite knowing full well that he was a criminal and that his activities caused harm. The story of Bumpy Johnson also reveals something important about the nature of power and agency in Black communities, about the ways that Black people have had to exercise power and control in contexts where legitimate channels for such power were systematically blocked and denied, and about the ways that charismatic individuals who could command respect and obedience could emerge as leaders and protectors even when their power was built on criminal enterprise. This is not an excuse for criminal activity, nor is it a suggestion that we should celebrate or romanticize figures like Bumpy Johnson, but it is a recognition that the conditions that produced him were not natural or inevitable, but rather were created by specific policies and practices of racism, discrimination, and exclusion, and that any serious analysis of Bumpy Johnson and his legacy must take these conditions into account. In the final analysis, the question of whether Bumpy Johnson kept crime out of Harlem, or just controlled, it seems almost to miss the deeper truth about what actually happened in Harlem during his era, which is that a man of extraordinary charisma and ruthlessness emerged from a community that was desperate for protection and was willing to accept his leadership and his protection in exchange for respecting his authority and his control over the criminal enterprises that operated in the neighborhood. What Bumpy Johnson provided was not the absence of crime, but rather the presence of a strong man who could enforce rules, who could protect people within his network from certain kinds of harm, who could maintain a kind of order in the streets, and who could intervene on behalf of community members in ways that seemed to reflect some degree of personal loyalty or commitment to the community. This was not perfect protection. It was not moral protection. And it was not protection that came without significant cost to the community, but it was protection of a kind, and in the context of the alternatives available to Black people in Harlem during that period, it was something that people were grateful for, and that they remembered with a mixture of gratitude and acknowledgement of its moral complexity. The transformation of Bumpy Johnson into a cultural icon, a folk hero, and eventually a character in television shows and movies, represents the working out in American popular culture of these complex questions about power, morality, community, and resistance. And the enduring interest in his story speaks to something deep in the American psyche about our fascination with individuals who can command power and authority, who seem to operate outside the system, and who appear to protect their communities, even when we know that their activities are criminal and harmful. The mythology of Bumpy Johnson endures because it speaks to real human needs and real human experiences, because it reflects something true about the nature of power and protection in marginalized communities, and because it offers a way of thinking about individual agency and community protection that does not require us to completely accept or completely reject the figure at the center of the story. But as historians and as people interested in truth, we must work to separate the mythology from the reality, to understand what Bumpy Johnson actually did and actually was, to recognize the genuine good that he may have done alongside the genuine harm that he caused, and to understand his life and his legacy within the broader context of American racism, urban poverty, and the ongoing struggle for Black freedom and dignity. The Bumpy Johnson story is ultimately a story about the choices that people face when legitimate paths to power and protection are systematically blocked, about the ways that individuals can exercise agency and create their own systems of power, even in the most constrained and oppressive circumstances, and about the moral complexity that emerges when people are forced to choose between imperfect protectors and no protection at all. Whether we celebrate Bumpy Johnson, condemn him, or maintain some more complex relationship to his legacy, we must recognize that he was a product of his time and his circumstances. A man who rose to power because the system that surrounded him was fundamentally unjust and unresponsive to the needs and dignity of his community, and whose ultimate fate was to be incorporated into the mythology of American crime and American resistance in ways that both acknowledge his power and minimize his harmful activities. The story of Bumpy Johnson will continue to be told and retold, reinterpreted in different contexts and for different purposes, and each retelling will reveal something about what the teller values and what the audience needs to believe about power, community, and the possibility of protection in an unjust world. In the end, the question of whether Bumpy Johnson kept crime out of Harlem or just controlled it may be less important than the larger question of what kind of protection and what kind of order are actually possible in a society structured by racism and inequality, and what the responsibilities of individuals and communities are to create better alternatives to the systems that have produced figures like Bumpy Johnson and made his emergence both possible and seemingly necessary. The answer to these questions may require us to move beyond both the mythology that celebrates Bumpy Johnson as a folk hero and the simple moralism that condemns him as merely a criminal, toward a more sophisticated understanding of power, agency, and responsibility in the context of American racism and urban struggle, an understanding that can hold multiple truths simultaneously and that can honor the real achievements and the real harm, the real agency and the real constraints, the real protection and the real exploitation that characterized Bumpy Johnson's rule in Harlem, and that continue to shape the possibilities for justice and dignity in Black communities across America today.